I am recording some post-read thoughts on The Evening and the Morning by Ken Follett. I just finished reading this last night. Um, this is the prequel to The Pillars of the Earth, which is one of my favorite books of all time. It's definitely one of my favorite novels. I think it's absolutely excellent. And this is the fourth book in the series. There's five total, and this is the fourth one that has come out. And it's a prequel, so it's set before the first one. Pillars of the Earth is, I feel like, one of the most unique novels that I've read, and I just love it. I love the style. I think it's brilliantly executed. The characters are great. The tension's awesome between kind of like our heroes and the villains in the story, and I just think the way that it traces these characters over such a long period of time and builds this kind of community is just so effective and so well done. And then I thought in the second book, the sequel to it, all of these are anthologies, so they're really set in a similar place, but the characters are all completely different. The second book, World Without End, I think both Pillars and World Without End are 5-star books. I think the quality of that one was basically it was on par with Pillars, just maybe not quite as iconic, and like Pillars centers around the construction of the main cathedral in this town called Kingsbridge. And then so World Without End kind of shifts, and it has like different construction projects, but it's not exactly as iconic as the first one. But I still think the quality and the style and everything is right on point, and so I really much enjoyed that. The third one is called A Column of Fire. I struggled with this one a little bit because I think it was definitely a good book, and I think it's great historical fiction. It's set during the Protestant Reformation, and specifically the English Reformation. And it kind of broke the mold from the usual formula, if you want to call it that, of the first two books. It really pushed rather than focusing on a small group of characters in Kingsbridge and the surrounding communities over a long period of time, it shifted things out to like broader geopolitical things. So we were shifting like not just Kingsbridge, but other cities in England. There were characters in France, Spain, Amsterdam, all over the place, and it felt much more of a broader tale, and a lot of the characters were actually historical figures, and he kind of just like, again, fictionalized it. So that book felt like great historical fiction to me, but as far as a Kingsbridge novel, I felt like it only maybe spent about 10% of the time in Kingsbridge, so I thought that was a little bit strange, and I didn't really like it as a Kingsbridge novel from that perspective. So that third one was definitely my least favorite of the three, even though I did enjoy reading it. I just didn't think it kind of fit in the same mold. So The Evening and the Morning is the fourth, and it's set before The Pillars of the Earth. This one definitely felt more akin to the first two, which I think was great. So it felt like a return to form. But I did feel like the quality was kind of a decent step down from the first two. So I think I'm going to put this one in my rankings third after Pillars, then World Without End, then Evening and the Morning, and then lastly will be A Column of Fire. So this book is about the same length as the other ones. This one's a little bit over 900 pages. And like I said, it does go back to, we have a very small cast of characters in this book. And I think it may actually be the smallest of any of the books. It's been years since I've read the first two, but it definitely feels like this is the smallest. And I think that's a good thing because, again, you have a lot of time to be able to focus on these characters and their interactions over the course of so many years, which I think is great. One quick thing. I like the title of this, The Evening and the Morning. All of the titles of the books in the series, at least up until this point, have some religious or specifically Christian connotation to it. And again, all of the books really center around Christianity as a whole because of cathedrals and kind of like the church structure with bishops and other figures being prominent, powerful figures just set within different respective times in each book. He also mentions that the Dark Ages is mentioned like in the preface to the book, and it's on the back of the above the synopsis as well. I think The Evening and the Morning is, in addition to being a Genesis 1, being pulled from Genesis 1, I think it's also meant to symbolize like the evening being kind of the dark periods of the Dark Ages, and then the morning kind of ending that and moving into something else, which kind of the end of this book is supposed to symbolize. So the synopsis basically tells you we have three main characters. There's a young boat builder. He's an architect. His name's Edgar. There's a French noblewoman that comes from the Normandy region of France. Her name is Ragna. And then there's a monk in the Shiring Abbey who his name is Aldred. And the three of them, I mean, you're pretty much explicitly told, like, those are your three main characters. And so all three of those characters, you see and spend a ton of time with them over the course of the book. The book is split into 4 parts. The first part is called The Wedding. The second is called The Trial. The third is called The Murder. And the fourth is called The City. I think the book gets off to a amazingly fast start. And I think it's through the first 2 parts or acts of the book, I think it's excellent. Follett does such a good job of building characters. I think he usually is able to build, like, our heroes are usually sympathetic, and then a lot of bad things will happen to them and you feel for them and you want to root for them, but they have a lot, to kind of build and overcome to be able to get where you want them to be. And that's where I do think you see great character arcs over the course of his books. And then he's also maybe the best at writing villains. Like, he writes despicable characters that do awful things and you want to see them destroyed. You want to see them lose. But over the course of the books, like, they obviously have success, and that's how it builds tension kind of between these character groups. So I think my favorite part of the book would be the second part called The Wedding. So part 1, part 2 is called The Trial. Part 1 called The Wedding I like because it's introducing us to our characters. All the characters are kind of in different spots to start. None of them are in what will become known as Kingsbridge, which I think is cool. So, for example, like, you see Ragna in her hometown in Normandy, and then she's going to come over to England. There's this big set piece at the beginning where Vikings attack the town of Combe, where Edgar and his family lives. They end up having to relocate to what becomes Kingsbridge after this. And then you see Aldred. I think you meet him later, but slightly later anyway. He crossed paths. He actually is introduced very early, but he doesn't end up coming back to England and crossing paths with some of our characters until later, especially after Edgar and his family move to, it's Dreng's Ferry is the name of the town. It becomes Kingsbridge, which I'll talk about later. So I like this introduction. I like kind of setting the stage and beginning those character developments. Like, you're also introduced to the main villains, if you will, is kind of like a cluster family of people. The Earl of kind of like the broader region of land where this is situated, his name is Wilf. And I'm going to spoil it. So if you don't want spoilers, just beware. But the wedding he ends up marrying Ragna. So she's a noblewoman, the daughter of a count in France. She then moves and marries the Earl. So that's part 1. And then also it's his 2 brothers, but I guess they're half brothers. One is the Bishop of Shiring, and then the other is, I forget he's a landowner, so people are subservient to him and owe him tribute and tax and other things on his land that people essentially rent from him. I'm blanking on the name that he used in this of the specific title. But anyway, that's Winston, and then Wilgum, I think is how you pronounce it, are the 2 brothers in those roles. And they all get kind of introduced. The book starts with this big set piece where there's an attack by Vikings on the town, and then a lot of the action and interaction from the characters kind of falls out from that. That's why Edgar and his family end up leaving Combe and going to Dreng's Ferry. This is kind of why Ragna ends up marrying Wilf, because there's seen to be political advantages on both sides of keeping Vikings kind of away from this part of England, even though there is some deceit going on. And then Aldred actually begins in France, like I mentioned, where you meet him with Ragna, and then he ends up coming back, and ultimately he is stationed at Shiring. it ends in, I think, a clever way where Ragna learns that not everything is as it seems. She definitely loves Wilf. He loves her, but he's also married to another woman, which is not a practice, at least in this book, is set up, that happens in French culture a lot, but it does in English culture. So she was totally unaware of this. She also learns that the king never ratified the marriage. So there's definitely a lot that she learns she was not being held privy to. And it kind of ends on this dramatic note. The trial, the second part, like I said, was my favorite. So basically what ends up happening is we come to find out that in this village called Dreng's Ferry, which will become Kingsbridge, there is a church. It's called a minster, and it's run by the Bishop Winston's cousin, and then also his brother. So also the cousin of Winston runs kind of like the main alehouse or like business kind of venture in the city. So they basically have their entire power structure, if you will, of this small little community. And we learn as the reader that basically there's a forging operation that Bishop Winston is running outside of, or he's running it inside of the minster, using somebody who makes like jewels and other ornaments and things for the church. And this is an entire thing where Edgar gets involved because he's living here now. And the sheriff that's appointed by the king gets involved. Ragna's involved. Aldred's involved. All of our main heroes. And it sets up in this this trial or like court confrontation. And it ends with the villains winning. And it actually is, I don't feel like Follett's books are usually overly violent, but there was an extremely violent sequence after the court is adjourned, and there's a guilty verdict that's given to not who we expect. It's given to another village member who was complicit in this crime, but he was definitely not the architect of it. And there's a very brutal scene where his penance is to get castrated and have his eyes gouged out. And it's like, I don't remember there being a scene quite that gruesome. And I was like, oh man, I don't know why Follett felt like he needed to put that in there in that much detail. But anyway, I think the conflict, I think, comes to a head in so many ways in this part. The back and forth between the kind of the heroes and the villain characters is excellent. And then there's a lot of falling out action that ends up becoming extremely important. So I think, Winston ends up learning especially that Ragna has a lot of power and she's trying to exert that. Aldred ends up getting moved from shiring to this church, which becomes a priory at Dreng's Ferry, even though that's not what he wanted. And then Edgar was also complicit, and he's already at Dreng's Ferry. So there's kind of some movement there, which becomes important. And I think all of these dynamics were fantastic. Part 3 is where I think it loses steam. So a lot of time passes between 2 and 3, and there's a lot at the start of it of just like, this happened, this person was born, this many years passed, this person was doing this. You don't really see the smaller moments, which I think is what makes the other parts of this book and other Kingsbridge books so good. Basically what ends up happening, very high level, is Wilf ends up getting injured in a fight against Vikings, and then he's kind of like on his deathbed. Not on his deathbed, he is recovering, but he's lost some mental acuity, and so Ragna is trying to basically rule in his stead while he recovers. And Winston and Wilgum are not happy about this, and they murder Wilf and essentially just take power over the earldom for themselves, which I think is an interesting set piece. I just don't exactly love what follows. So Ragna and Edgar basically have a plan to run away together to Dreng's Ferry and kind of get away from this. Through an informant, they end up getting wind of this plan and they kidnap her, and she's kidnapped for basically like a year or so in the book. And I just thought this part basically kind of became a little bit of a slog. I feel like we lose everything that made Edgar interesting, like his motivations. It all just became about finding her. And we weren't really seeing anything else that was going on in his life. We just hear he was working on this, he did this, he built this, but you don't really track any of that stuff. So I think Aldred became the most interesting character in this time with what he was doing. And then I think, again, it just takes like one turn too many where she ends up having Wilgum's son because he forced himself upon her. And now so she had 3 legitimate sons with Wilf. So she is, I mean, I think considering that, like, she would be the rightful heir acting as regent for Wilf. But then Winston and Wilgum made this pitch to the king that she had his son, and so they should be the rightful heirs, continuing on with that. So then there became some tension there. And then, yeah, it ultimately, like, she was kidnapped for a year. No one could find her. And then all of a sudden the king's about to show up. So then they just, like, let her go. And it felt like it was, that piece felt like it was one step too many, maybe, because then after this, she ends up basically forcibly marrying Wilgum. And I don't know. I feel like this stretched things out a little bit too much. And then part 4 is basically wrapping everything up. All of our villains basically end up getting their comeuppance. And then you start to get a lot established for what, like, moves you towards Pillars of the Earth and Kingsbridge as we know it. So Edgar, when Ragnar ends up forcibly essentially marrying Wilgum, he just leaves and goes to France and becomes a builder. When he learns that eventually Wilgum divorces Ragnar, he does come back and they end up in Kingsbridge together, which was very predictable. But they had a lot of really good scenes together. And I think their connection was one of the more interesting, like, dynamics across, like, the book, because you figured it was going to happen, but it did take a long time and there were a lot of twists and turns to get there. Aldred basically ends up becoming an extremely important figure in the newly established priory at Drings Ferry, which becomes Kingsbridge. And at the end of the book, when Bishop Winston dies, he ends up being named Bishop of Shiring, but then he maneuvers to have the bishopric moved to Kingsbridge, which is important because that's what essentially starts Pillars of the Earth. So they have an existing building. It essentially is not big enough to accommodate all the means of, what a cathedral needs to do. And so he and Edgar basically plan and have a foundation for a church, and that is set in stone at the end of the book. So that's how, in Pillars of the Earth, Tom Builder and then ultimately Jack are able to build from that foundation, and then Prior Philip is basically able to use that as justification for the bishopric remaining in Kingsbridge for Shiring. But it also makes this kind of power dynamic between the two, which is interesting. And so Aldred ends up there, and then Ragna, again, she ends up back with Edgar and kind of a power position, but not quite to the level of what she was at before. So it all ends up fine. I think that you really start to see in part 3 and 4, again, the move towards, like, making this a Pillars prequel. So you see, like, the saint who there's a relic of in Kingsbridge Cathedral in Pillars of the Earth. Like, you see Aldred come up with a plan of, like, I need to raise money for this very small priory that's struggling to put food on the table. And he comes up with this strategy of going and finding somebody that he knows, finding this relic, and then making it basically like a destination. You see him convincing the king to allow the town to have market rights and be able to raise money that way, which is a big factor also in Pillars of the Earth in Kingsbridge. And then, literally the town becomes named Kingsbridge because Edgar builds a bridge basically at the behest of the king instead of having to take a raft across this ferry, which was a very, very big plot point throughout most of the book. So you see a lot of that stuff, and if you've read Pillars of the Earth, like, you'll definitely find the nods, and I think most of them are good. Also, Leper Island is a big, like, that's something that is name dropped very, very early on when Edgar and his family moved to Drings Ferry. And again, if you've read Pillars of the Earth, that's like, you're in what will become Kingsbridge. So some of it might have felt a little convenient, but writ large, I thought all that worked pretty good. So yeah, I enjoyed this book. I mean, there's a lot more I could say in more detail because there's so many smaller characters that have interactions with our main characters, but those are kind of like the big plot points of how it moves from from part to part. I definitely loved part one and part two. And then it loses a little bit of steam for me, but I think it mostly ends up in a pretty good place. So overall, I mean, it's a great read. Again, it's my third favorite of these books. I liked it, and I would say it's a good book for sure. One of the things I will say is that I think Ragna is the most interesting character out of the main three, like by a mile. I think she has the most development, and she has the most that's kind of like put on her to work through. She ends up, I should have said this, she ends up murdering is now become her ex-husband, Wilgum, at this point. She murders him. And he had it come in because he was a despicable character. But I really, really liked that. I didn't feel that was something that you would have seen from other characters in past Kingsbridge novels. But she had all of that rage built up in her, and that's how it came out. And I thought that was a really cool choice, actually. She's flawed in that way that she was willing to do that, but it shows like all that happened to her to, get her to a place where she would act out in that way. So I thought that was cool. And then Edgar was a little bit too perfect. Like, he could do everything. I mean, like I said, he builds this bridge, which the town is named for. He ends up like restructuring and kind of rebuilding the existing church there. He lays the foundation for the new church. It's said that he builds all of these houses and is basically the reason why people start to like actually move there. The first thing he built was an ale house. He came up with a way to dig canals to capture fish, and so a fishing market was there because of him. He built another canal in this other village for Ragna that she was the lord of after the wedding. He built her a canal there to make it easier to transport stone to and from the villages. He literally could do everything, and it felt a little bit too easy that he could literally do it all. So that I didn't love as much. And then Aldred, I think, was a good character because I'm always interested in the religious aspects that he's able to put in here of like the very powerful, and in this case, greedy and corrupt bishop versus a lowly monk, or he becomes the prior of a very small priory, but he's definitely fighting an uphill battle. And it's cool to see him have to maneuver kind of like in that religious, like institutional realm, and be able to ultimately like become a prominent figure, but doing it in a way that's obviously not corrupt and evil like Winston did. So I think that's all I've got. I would say I think I give this a 3.5. I'm between a 3.5 and a 4, but the way that it kind of stalled between acts, really in Act 3, I think kind of lost the steam for it. But for me, a 3.5 is a good book. It's a really good read. I'm not sure that I would revisit this one as quickly as I would for, say, Pillars or World Without End, but again, in general, it's definitely a good book, and it did feel like a return to form to the first two books in the series for me. So I have one last one to read called The Armor of Light. It's the 5th book, and I think it's set post-Enlightenment, I think during the Napoleonic Wars. So I'm extremely excited to read that one. I am sad that it will be the last one. But like I said, I'm going to revisit Pillars and World Without End several times probably. So those are my quick post-read thoughts.